Hello and welcome to our podcast on the genre of the Western. Now our plan is that this is a follow-up to the more general genre overview that we created in another video. And if you're watching this second, that's great. See how this becomes a little bit more specific and focused on just the genre of the Western. If you haven't seen the original, you can certainly watch this. It's not rocket science, you can totally figure it out. But we are going to be talking specifically about the genre of the Western, while also hoping that you remember some of the common patterns that genres themselves stand for. So like we mentioned in our overview, a film genre is a grouping of films that tend to share similar patterns, themes, iconography, costuming, types of characters, and story evolutions. The Western is no different from any other genre in that fact that they kind of have these patterns that extend from the earliest ones all the way to the Westerns we see today. There tend to be great parallels between them. So looking at our first point, the idea of themes or thematic issues, the themes or thematic issues in the Western tends to be the idea of one group taking over another. And originally in the genre, that was the idea of white Europeans taking over Native Americans, or the idea of the good guys, the law-abiding citizens, dealing with outlaws, heroes versus villains. But what about the idea of the movie Avatar? Are there some elements of one group trying to take over another in that one? Who do we side with? Are we okay with the people coming in to ravage the land, or do we tend to side with the blue native people? And I think when we look at that, even Avatar, even though it's super high tech and on the more modern end of films, it does have some thematic issues that are very similar to the Western. We also see the idea of codes of honor. What's it mean to be a true hero? Nature versus culture, and also freedom versus restriction. And so oftentimes in the original parts of the genre, that was stuff like the frontier, the freedom of the Native American's life versus the sort of restriction of the white European's life, of the laws, of the regulations, of perhaps the army life that they're coming in from. So when we see these and we're looking at the Western genre, we're going to see that many films that fit into this little puzzle piece tend to have very similar thematic issues like these. Iconography, the repeated images that pervade a film genre for the Western, tend to be things that deal with the cowboy. So things like the covered wagon in some of the older, more traditional Westerns. But then if we're not using wagons to get west, maybe we have to use the railroad. We also have the settler's starched dress outfit where we get the white blouse under some sort of almost overall denim-y kind of thing that we see a lot of women wearing in Westerns. Indians' overly stereotypical tribal clothing, the idea that a loner comes to town, the cowboy vests, the revolvers, the idea that the saloon is some sort of central place in many of these no-street towns. But then we also get the idea of the schoolhouse and the church. Where do they fit into these stories? We know they exist in these Western towns, but are they as important as the saloon, which tends to show up in every single Western film? What are the creators trying to teach us through this genre? When we get good guy versus bad guy and a lot of this stuff happens in a saloon, are they trying to pass some sort of moral lesson on to us? We have to look at that throughout the genre. But in terms of iconography, these are the kinds of things that repeat over and over again throughout the genre of the Western. Another part of a genre that continues to transpire throughout its evolution is the idea of the mood of a film. And oftentimes the Western has very clear lines between who is good and who is bad, especially in the early parts and early developments of the genre. We can tell very clearly that the guy who dresses in the white hat is good, and the guy who wears the black hat is bad. They're doing their best to teach the idea of right and wrong through this film that happens to be set in the West with a lot of the iconography that we mentioned. Cinematic style is how the film is shot. What kind of shots do we have? What kind of camera angles? What kind of camera motion do we have? Or lighting or sound that pervades and changes within a genre? So in the Western, we tend to have a lot of establishing shots, long shots, things from great distance so we can see the landscape. We can see how barren this land is, and the only hope for that barren land is the lone stranger who comes in to save the town. We're probably going to have a lot of sweeping camera movements, again, to show the expanse and how large the West is. And then here's the one little guy who can come in there and save the times. The lighting, often pretty low key, meaning it's creating shadows, and often kind of film noir with some stark shadows and long shadows there. Again, kind of the grammar of film. A character who's positive is going to have high key lighting on them. They're very out in the open, there aren't shadows around them. Whereas the definitive bad guy is going to get the shadows, the harshly angled lighting on them, and probably some sort of scary music when they come on. So we know, at least in the early part of the genre, that that guy is the bad guy. And so as we mentioned in the podcast on the overview of genres, genres evolve, they change, they go through different stages. The primitive stage of this genre is where we have patterns developing, themes, iconography. An example of that is the Great Train Robbery. This really sets up the beginning of this genre, where there is a clear good guy, the guy who gets tied up in the train station, and then we have clear bad guys, the guys who come in and plan to rob the train, who rob the train and then escape and, do some shooting and hostage taking and stuff like that. We also see the iconography, the horse riding, the western saddle, the cowboy hats, the revolvers. When they were making the Great Train Robbery, they weren't saying, hey, we're going to make a pattern that people are going to enjoy for the next 100 years. No, they were just telling a story as they felt they wanted to set it in the West and all the stereotypes that went with that. In hindsight, as historians, we can look back and go, this really started this pattern of good versus evil, black versus white, good guys, bad guys, riding in on the horse and saving people and riding off into the sunset. But an example of the primitive stage would definitely be the Great Train Robbery. As filmmakers became attuned to the success of that pattern, we get the classical stage of the genre, where those patterns continue. We still have good guys, bad guys, revolvers, vests, cowboys, stagecoaches, all kinds of things like that. And so we get example movies like Stagecoach with John Wayne, High Noon with Gary Cooper, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with Clint Eastwood. They're very stereotypically Western. The loner comes in to save somebody. There's the innocent woman who needs saving. There's a clear bad guy. And it's all set in these vast open stretches of the West. The studio saw that this pattern was doing well and people wanted to see this over and over again, so they kind of took the basic storyline, themes, iconography, and continued cranking out films that were very similar to each other. Then we might get the revisionist stage of the genre, where things become a little bit more complex and ambiguous. And so things might be set in the West. We might have the ideas of cowboys and good guys and bad guys, but some of the things are a little bit more ambiguous. So for example, The Wild Bunch, Little Big Man about Custer, or Dances with Wolves with Kevin Costner. We don't really have cowboys and Indians. We kind of have former Army officers and Native Americans who at first do the very stereotypical thing, which is not trust each other. And then with time, they become to learn from each other and understand, and then grow to become more close. We see some ties to the original genre in here, and that you see similar iconography, but things are a little bit more gray, things are a little bit more ambiguous, and this is the revisionist stage. Eventually, like all genres, they tend to descend into the perotic stage, where the genre is mocked. So we may have the idea, the themes of being an individual, the themes of the great frontier and conquering something, and the same iconography, people wearing holstered revolvers, wearing cowboy hats. But the films themselves tend to look at themselves and make fun of themselves. You can't look at Blazing Saddles and think that it's a serious look at the West, but it has all the elements that the other Westerns have. The sheriff has to come in and save the town from the clear bad guys. They're going to use railroads. They're going to have one-street towns. They're going to have horses and revolvers and cowboy hats and vests. But if you know movies that fit into this part of the genre, you can see that they are funny, They're making fun of the sheriff who saves everybody. They're making fun of the bad guy and making him a complete buffoon. So they're taking the original patterns, kind of turning them on their heads, and making fun of them in the perotic stage. And then kind of the final evolution of any genre is the idea of the extension, where we kind of revert back to the original values and themes of the beginning primitive stages, but everything seems to be completely divergently more modern. So we get something like Blade Runner, set in the future. Harrison Ford is like a rogue cop working on his own, trying to fight good and evil kind of thing. Does that have overlaps to the primitive stage, where it's good versus evil, black and white? It does. What about Star Wars? Good versus evil. The way Han Solo is dressed, he tends to have some sort of a Western vest on. He tends to have kind of jean pants. He tends to have the blaster around his waist rather than a revolver. But all that iconography is very similar to that of the Western. So that's it in terms of our look at the genre of the Western. Again, the point is, we have these patterns in film that seem to be very pervasive. Many movies throughout our film history tend to go back to this pattern of the Western, the things they stand for, the themes, the icons, the characters within them. The genre not only has this kind of longitudinal pattern, but it has some change and arc to it. It's not going to be the same now as it was in 1940, but we are going to see throwbacks to that. Winks and nods back to the genre. Maybe new movies that make fun of the genre. But the point is that the Western as an idea is a pervasive pattern, and that constitutes a film genre. As always, if you have any questions, please bring those into class. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.